If we observe these rights for ourselves and for others, I think we will find that it is easier in the world to build peace, because war destroys all human rights and freedoms. So in fighting for those, we fight for peace.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a document that was really ahead of its time. So adopted in 1948, drawing from the experience of World War II and the Holocaust, it set out fundamental principles of equal respect for human rights for all citizens, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, gender, principles that were not really in practice in most countries in the world at that time, including here in the United States. And if you go back and you read that document now, it still resonates in terms of the issues that we continue to see in protection of human rights all over the world. The last 75 years have been a mixed bag for human rights. We've seen tremendous progress in some areas, but we continue to see egregious human rights abuse taking place all over the world. Just in the last few months, we continue to see the consequences of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. We've seen the largest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust. We've seen the overwhelming Israeli military response in Gaza, a devastating conflict in Sudan. And so the situation right now feels very dire. The continued outbreak of conflict is very often a driver of egregious human rights abuse, but we also see abuse by authoritarian regimes. Right now in China, the Uyghur population has been abused by the Chinese government, put into re-education camps, pressed into forced labor in an attempt to erase their cultural identity and their religious identity. And even in democracies, we're seeing backsliding on human rights, on press freedom, on freedom of association. The evolution of technology has a really interesting impact on human rights. It's a double-edged sword, really. So technology, on the one hand, is an incredible empowerer of people. So 2/3 of the world's population is now online. The digital public sphere has been incredibly empowering for citizen engagement with governments, and that's a good thing. The flip side of that is that, of course, technology has been misused and abused by governments against their population in ways that the drafters of the UDHR couldn't have envisioned in 1948. The climate crisis is another issue that the drafters of the UDHR did not envision, but is now absolutely central to our thinking about human rights. Particularly the people who are most affected by climate change tend to be marginalized groups whose human rights are most at risk. Just last year, the UN General Assembly agreed that we should have a right to a healthy environment, a right that's not specifically listed in the UDHR, and is one of the first examples of the UN acknowledging a fundamental right that didn't exist in 1948. One of the challenges that the Universal Declaration faces is that it's a statement of principles. It didn't come with an accountability mechanism, and it's been proven very difficult to hold states accountable where human rights violations occur, particularly countries that sit on the UN Security Council. The international system has mechanisms for accountability, but they're not always applied consistently, and the consequences don't always match the seriousness of the crime committed. We've seen an evolution in that system over the last 75 years, particularly with the adoption of the International Criminal Court, but we still have an enormous gap in terms of accountability for most human rights abuse. However, over the last few decades, other actors have taken on an increasingly important role in the human rights landscape. So 12 years ago, the UN adopted the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights, and that outlined for the first time the responsibility of business, of the private sector, to respect human rights in their operations, moving in parallel with the government's responsibility to protect human rights. So that's a really important development, and I think most large corporations now have their own human rights policy, and increasingly it's an expectation of investors, of consumers, of employees that companies consider human rights as part of their business model. The other actor that has played a really important role in human rights, particularly over the last few decades, is civil society organizations, NGOs. And they've always been a part of the UN system, but the responsibility and the impact that human rights organizations have in terms of calling out abuse where it occurs, documenting it for posterity, bringing cases in court against abusive actors has really evolved and is really central to the accountability mechanisms that have begun to operate in the human rights system.